Good evening, everybody, and welcome back from our little summer break. It would be the first time that Dione hasn't been able to enjoy the Jaws talk. She loved the Jaws talks, and as you all know, she died earlier this week in peaceful way, surrounded by her family. And the last thing she would want is for all of us to be miserable. But I think it would be remiss of me not to mention that. Secondly, as you well know, we've now got Ron Bateman about to talk to us, and I'm extremely grateful to him for standing in at short notice. I emailed Anna Funder about a month ago, I suppose now, to say how disappointed, after all the help we'd given her, I was with her book Wifedom on Eileen, which I believe has done the opposite of what she sought to do, which has diminished Eileen rather than given her the sort of recognition that Sylvia Top gave in her very comprehensive, well-researched biography. A little while after that, I had an email from her Australian publicist saying they'd had to change their agenda, and Anna wouldn't be available now because she is apparently travelling to Brisbane for an event, a publicity event they've organised for her. I replied saying, please let me know when you would like to offer another date. The silence has been eloquent, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. So let's put that to bed and get on with enjoying a good evening with Ron. Ron Bateman has published several books on all sorts of interesting things to do with his life and interests, including his latest book about the BBC in wartime, which includes a big section, obviously, on Orwell. Ron was one of the founding members of the Orwell Society, and was there and present when I came to what I think was the third committee meeting at Richard's invitation, and has been a great supporter of the Orwell Society ever since. So over to you, Ron.
Well, good evening, everybody. As Quentin said, it's been a very difficult week for the Society, with the passing of Dione still very much uppermost in our minds. But as he said, she did enjoy these talks, and I know for certain she would want us to go ahead. So how come is it that I have what appears to be an oven-ready talk prepared? Well, around 10 years ago, maybe 9, I presented this talk in libraries in and around Swindon. Various bits and pieces have gone missing mainly because I seem to live in 2 countries, but including 1 or 2 books. Robert Capa. He covered 5 campaigns as a photojournalist. Obviously, we're going to be covering the Spanish Civil War because it's of particular interest to us. And we will also be taking a look at some of the images he took in World War II, which are particularly interesting. Now, I guess the first thing to make clear is that there really was no such person as Robert Capa. He was actually Andre Friedman, born in Budapest in 1913 to Jewish parents. The origins of his name we'll talk a little bit about later on. I was actually quite surprised to discover this image because it was very difficult to come by. I remember messaging Jane Rogoyska, who wrote the biography of Gerda Taro, just to check that it was him. And she absolutely assured me that it was. Now, We don't know exactly when it was taken, but I would guess towards the late 20s. He looks about 16, 17-ish. Now, during the post-war era of political turmoil, young Andre Freeman was a bit of a tearaway. He used to hang out with all sorts of groups, mainly communist agitators, that sort of thing, without being particularly politically minded. And he ultimately got himself arrested. Now, his parents, when they bailed him out, they advised him to channel his opinions within the law and packed him off to Berlin to learn to be a journalist. And when I say packed him off, they basically gave him a packed lunch and opened the door and out he went, because Capa claimed that he walked all the way from Budapest to Berlin with a friend. And they were going to finance him once he got there. And here we have his original student card. He spent maybe about 2 years studying journalism. But his ambition was relatively short-lived because the Hungarian economy collapsed and his parents could no longer finance him. So he began to consider photography as a career. He thought that if he could just acquire a camera, it would make him a photographer, and he just had to find a way of making money with it. And with this in mind, he managed to find a job as a darkroom assistant in Berlin and immediately found the atmosphere really exciting. Photographers returning from assignments all over the world. And at this time, of course, he was desperately poor. He slept on park benches by night and in the darkroom by day, and only really made money by undercutting the regular suppliers of equipment for the business. Now, one day he developed some photos by someone who had gone off to India on a special assignment, which excited him to the extent that without forethought, he burst into the boss's office to show him the images. It was a reckless and stupid action which would ordinarily have seen him fired. But fortunately for Andre, his boss reacted differently. He particularly admired his enthusiasm and gave him his first Leica camera and began sending him off on small assignments. And there we have his original Leica camera. He was a great fan of this type of camera. I mean, it was German, it was compact, easy to handle, and he got great results with it, amazing results. Now, eventually, the day came when he got his first big break. Word got out that the Marxist revolutionary and theorist Leon Trotsky would be speaking in Copenhagen. Trotsky had been holed up in Istanbul up until now. No country would issue him a visa, and he was constantly in danger of an assassin's bullet. Now, on this occasion, all the other photographers were out. Andre looked at the boss looked at Andre, and he simply shouted, "Go." Now, Trotsky never liked being photographed. The established photographers with their big box cameras were refused entry. Capa, or Andre, as we should call him at that time, simply strolled in with his small camera tucked away in his pocket. And thinking back, Capa's golden rule throughout his career was, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not near enough. And it served him particularly well that day. This was his first ever published photograph. It was with that small camera that he captured the power of Trotsky's oratorical charisma to great effect. In fact, if we look at the full spread of images that were published, it was an impressive debut indeed. And you can just about see his name, Friedman, in the bottom right-hand corner there. Let's scroll down there. Now, Andre's taste of the spotlight was short-lived. Just days later, the ailing Hindenburg had made Hitler Chancellor of Germany. And as a Jew in Berlin, Andre was in grave danger. Very soon, the brown shirts would be giving him more than just dirty looks. So he had to quit Berlin, and eventually he wound up in Paris. Despite occasional odd jobs afforded him through various photographic agencies that he signed up with, he was often hungry and penniless, persistently getting thrown out of hotels for non-payment. Now, one day when he had been assigned to take some publicity photos for a Swiss firm, he met a short, attractive, red-headed young woman by the name of Gerda Porharola. Now, there's Gerda. Andre and Gerda hit it off instantly. He was captivated by her. She was intelligent, confident, and like him, also a very keen photographer. I guess put simply, they fell in love. I've lost me. There we are. They fell in love. They became inseparable. This famous image of the couple was taken in Paris in 1935 by their mutual friend, Fred Steen. Now, Gerda was exactly what Andre needed. She recognized his potential, but also his limitations. She saw from his appearance and in his manner that he lacked discipline. He needed guidance and encouragement, someone to push him. Andre called her his little red fox. And using a little of that cunning we associate with foxes, Gerda hatched a fantastic idea. They would invent a famous American photographer, and they came up with the name Robert Capa. I mean, it was probably a play on the film director Frank Capra, who was particularly famous at that time. Gerda would play the go-between, and they would make loads and loads of money. Well, it worked. Publications fell over themselves to engage this famous American photographer for an assignment. Now, Gerda changed her name too. Porharola looked unpronounceable on paper, and I can vouch for that because when I first saw it, I had no idea how to pronounce it. Unfortunately, there was a YouTube channel that taught me how you should pronounce it. She wanted something more catchy. Taro was a Japanese artist she particularly admired, so she became Gerda Taro. And soon after they met, events in Spain unfolded that would give them their first opportunity of covering a major assignment together. So off they went. Robert Capa, Gerda Taro, they went to Spain together as a team, in love and excited at the prospect of fighting fascism through the power of the camera. Now, Capa's earliest images were of loyalist soldiers heading off to the front. The graffiti you can see on that side of the train actually reads, "Swear upon these fraternal letters that you will sooner die than consent to tyranny." And we see another one here that he took in Madrid. On the left, you can see the soldier going off, the young soldier going off to the front, young and inexperienced. And as we know from Orwell's accounts of his time in the trenches, the young soldiers were often indisciplined. Alongside it, there's a typical Capa image taken in Barcelona, obviously much too young for the trenches. Capa had this knack of being on the spot whenever certain flashpoints occurred. I call this picture, "Whose Side Are You On?" I don't know why that's suddenly gone. Whose side are you on? As there is obviously a marked level of suspicion directed against the guy on the left with his arms out, who was since identified as a fascist. Now, also, remembering Orwell's descriptions of trench life, the unending boredom when nothing much happens, we have the POUM, the POUM militiaman, waiting for something to happen. Now, desperate to find some action, he and Gerda drove out to the region of Cuero Muriano, where they had heard there was fighting. And it was here that Capa took his most famous and most controversial image, the death of a loyalist militiaman, otherwise known as the falling soldier. And this took pride of place in an impressive spread published in Vue magazine. Why was it controversial? Well, if I just find one of my readers, the controversy actually began in the mid-1970s. Richard Whelan, who was Capa's first biographer, discredited all evidence that seemed to suggest that Capa had faked the photograph. And he asserted the image to be genuine. In an essay in 2002, he announced that the man had been identified, and it was comprehensively proven that he had been killed. He said, there can be no further doubt that the falling soldier is a photograph of Federico Borrell Garcia at the moment of his death in Cuero Muriano on September the 5th, 1936. And may the slanderous controversy that has plagued Capa's reputation for 25 years now at least come to an end with a verdict decisively in favor of Capa's integrity. Now, Kershaw questioned Whelan's sources, as there had been no identification of this man in 60 years. And then in 2003, a Spanish historian discovered an article in an obscure anarchist magazine published in 1937, which included a testimony given by a man who had witnessed Garcia's death as he sheltered behind a tree in a completely different landscape. Now, armed with this information, another team of researchers set about pinpointing the exact location. And if I show you some of these slides, they came up with a very interesting finding. If we go back to the original falling soldier, you can see just down there on the bottom right, there's a clearing in the field there. It's a start, it's a beginning, it's something maybe they could go on to identify the location. Now, Garcia wasn't the only person who was allegedly killed that day. There was another soldier killed who Capa also photographed. And we see another clearing to the left there in the yellow box. So that is something a bit more, clearing with a couple of buildings. They've got a bit more to go on. So if we move across to another image Capa took of the battalion that Garcia was serving in, we see the clearing from the last picture on the left in the yellow box. And now we have the contours of the mountain range. And if we look at a photograph of the present day region where they picked up both of those landmarks, you can see that they found almost the exact spot where they think that image was taken. If we look at the two together, you can see the contours of the mountain range is very, very similar, as is the clearing. Now, what this shows us was that the image was actually taken 30 miles to the south of Cuero Muriano at a place called Espillo. Now, the problem here, this was on the Cordoba front, by the way, the problem was that the fronts at this particular point were 15 miles away, and there were no reports of any fighting on that particular day. You know, although, to be fair, the fronts were not always fixed and there were regular skirmishes. It's possible that it just wasn't recorded. Now, if we look at some of the other images that were taken, we can see that it appears to be loyalist troops fooling around, maybe trying to impress Gerda, an attractive young woman with a camera. We see again the anarchist chief on the left appears to be putting them through their paces. And some more recent images discovered showed the same sort of thing. We see what appears to be Garcia second from the left. Now, all of this gave rise to a new theory that was corroborated by a good friend of Capa's called Hansel Meath, who overheard an argument between Capa and her husband. Capa had apparently been encouraging the men to stage maneuvers for the benefit of a camera when a lone nationalist sniper opened fire, killing 2 of the soldiers. This is now the most commonly held view. The question still remains, how can we determine proof of death? Now, Richard Whelan, the biographer, confided in a close associate of his, the chief of homicide in the Memphis Police Department. And he came up with the theory. He was certain that the man had been killed, because if you look at the hand underneath his left thigh, it's in the clenched position. If they'd been falling around, he was sure that his arm would have been spread out behind him as he fell backwards. And that clenched fist gives the indication that he had actually been shot and killed. We can never be sure that this is what happened, but we do know that both Capa and Taro were present at the Cordoba front. Now, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about that. Gerda stayed on at the Cordoba front shortly after that was taken, all right up until December 1936. And we see here a picture of her on the front line, peering through see if she can see what the soldier can see. Now, meanwhile, at this time, Capa was back in Madrid, where he took this image of a Republican soldier going off to war on a donkey in a somewhat unconventional way. Again, another typical Capa image. Now, it was also during that trip to Madrid that Capa became probably the first person to photograph victims of aerial bombardment, people who had lost everything in an instant. And the following year, he headed to Bilbao, where he learned that the truth about war is not necessarily found in the heat of battle, but more likely on the faces of terrified civilians behind the lines, ravaged by fear, suffering, and loss. Now, the nationalists had complete control of the skies. The Luftwaffe pilots of the Condor Legion under Hermann Goering showed no mercy. And Capa took these amazing images in Bilbao of people basically running for their lives when the siren sounds over Bilbao. Now, many of these photos from these people, this period, are basically studies of people under extreme stress, looking skywards. Again, Capa's in the right place at the right time to capture these images of people running for their lives. Now, shortly after these images were taken, Capa was to experience his own personal tragedy, something that he would never truly recovered from. Capa had returned to Paris while Gerda had stayed on in Spain to cover the Battle of Brunet on the outskirts of Madrid. She was due to reunite with Capa in Paris to prepare for an assignment to China. Now, this image of Gerda taking pictures at Brunet is the only image that exists of her on that particular assignment. Shortly after this image was taken, she died a particularly horrible death while standing on the running board of a vehicle carrying wounded soldiers that collided with an out-of-control tank. Taro became the first female photojournalist to die on the front line in the field of battle. She was not yet 26 years of age. And for many days afterwards, Capa was inconsolable with grief. Her funeral was held in Paris, coincidentally on her 26th birthday. The Communist Party of France declared her an anti-fascist martyr and organized a huge procession fit for a heroine. In death, she seemed to have found the fame that she had craved in life. But this was not the end of her story. Much more was learned about Taro's photojournalism during the Spanish Civil War by the discovery of something we call the Mexican suitcase. Now, as you can see, almost immediately, it's not actually a suitcase. It was actually 3 cardboard boxes containing a grid on the inside lid describing the content of each of the rolls of negatives. Now, how did these come to be lost? Well, when Capa and Taro were in Spain, a friend of his, Americo Weiss, took care of the darkroom, developed and printed the returning films while Capa remained in the field. When the Nazis entered Paris in 1940, Weiss joined many of the Jews fleeing the occupation. How the rolls of film ended up in Mexico is something of a complete mystery. At some point, it's believed they fell into the hands of the Mexican ambassador to Vichy, France. And Capa's brother Cornell was not alerted to their existence until late in the 1990s. The rolls of film were probably discovered. The rolls of film were recovered in 2008. And I'll talk a little bit more about Gerda in between this and the next section. Capa eventually returned to Spain again in, I believe it was, here we are, October 1938. And these images here were taken in Mont Blanc near Barcelona, and they show the mass ranks of the international brigade being decommissioned at Stalin's insistence. Stalin had one eye on a pact with Hitler at this particular point, and Hitler was determined that these international brigaders would be withdrawn before he would consider it. So obviously, where are we? Stalin strong-armed the Republican leaders to decommission the International Brigade. Now, these images gave rise to some very powerful photographs that show how passionately these Republican soldiers were devoted to the cause. Here again, we see probably the most used image of the Spanish Civil War. How many times have we seen this photograph? And it finds its way onto the cover of so many books about the conflict, including Orwell's. Now, Capa returned to Spain again in 1939 to photograph refugees escaping from the advance of the Nationalist Army. This one in particular caught my eye. To quote Capa's words, "A little girl lies on a few bags. She hardly moves. Only her big dark eyes follow my movements. It's not always easy to stand aside and be unable to do anything except record the sufferings around one." But further down the track, he took this another powerful image of a woman on the road between Tarragona and Barcelona. Both her oxen and her dog had been killed in an air raid. Her cart was destroyed, and she walked round and round the cart in a shell-shocked state of confusion. And he also photographed the defeated Republican troops headed towards the French border, where they would be interned in camps indefinitely. The misery inside these French camps, this particular one at Argelès-sur-Mer, is captured magnificently in these images of men desperately clinging on to faint hopes of survival in deplorable conditions. Just so we can have a little, can't see me, a little break between these two PowerPoints. I'll just tell you a little bit more about Gerda Taro, because up until the turn of the century and beyond, the only biography of Taro by Irma Schwaber was available in the German language. But then I think in 2006, we finally had our own monograph of Gerda Taro. It's a superb book. It brought together much of the information that was known about her at the time and some superb images. And then after the discovery of the Mexican suitcase, we had Jane Regoyska's first biography in the English language, and it's brought Taro's monograph fully up to date now. But some of you will probably remember that Jane Regoyska was a speaker at one of our AGMs in the early days, maybe 7 or 8 years ago.
It was the second one, Ron.
The second one, yeah.
It was the first one we had at Greenwich.
Yeah, we couldn't get the projector to work, could we?
No.
Yeah, and if you're particularly interested in owning the full collection of Capa's Spanish photographs, this is a fantastic book to get hold of, Heart of Spain. It's got the lot in there, plus some very good essays by Richard Whelan, Catherine Coleman, and Juan Fusi Asperua, whoever he may be. So with time very much getting ahead of us, it's probably best if we crack on with the next ones are not so long, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the images he took in World War II. Now, Capa's assignments in America and Mexico meant that he was quite a late comer into the war as a photojournalist. In April 1940, he was committed to a 6-month assignment for Life magazine, covering the volatile situation in Mexico at the time of the elections. His first World War II assignment wasn't until 1941, when he went to Lambeth in London to photograph victims of the Blitz for a book by Diana Forbes Robertson called The Battle of Waterloo Road. A fantastic little book. It's just been reprinted. You can get copies of it. And we'll just look at a few of those. There were loads of images, but just pick out a few. This was Father Hutchinson on his way to read the lesson in his bombed out church. You can see there on the right. He knows that one day that church will rise again glorious from its ruins. And the next images, on the left, we see a woman reading aloud from a letter she has just received from her son at the front, while on the right, we see a friendly ARP official comforting a woman who has just lost everything in an air raid. Terrific images. There are many more. As I said, it's a great book to get hold of. Now, Capa learned one very valuable lesson while he was in London, where he was often detailed to photograph the returning aircraft that often contained dead or injured airmen. And it was at Shalverston in England, when photographing an injured airman being led from a flying fortress of 301st Bomber Group, that he incurred the wrath of another airman, who inquired of him whether the image of the injured man was what he had been hanging around for. Capa snapped his camera shut and left the scene. He thought long and locked himself away and thought long and hard about what it was he was actually doing. He knew he had been right to take the image, but he somehow felt bad about it. He resolved that night that the sort of photography that he was taking was only for undertakers, and he didn't like being one. He said to himself, if I was to share the funeral, I swore I would have to share the procession. This meant sharing the risk, putting himself in harm's way, which he did on many occasions. His next assignment was to North Africa, where he quickly realized he would have to undergo parachute training if he was to get the accreditation needed to embed himself with the 82nd Airborne for the invasion of Italy. Now, this he achieved, but not before he took this famous image of an American fighter pilot in Tunisia. Now, for many years, this image was always labeled as having been taken in England and being an English fighter pilot. You can see from the side of the aircraft that it includes 9 German and 1 Italian kills to his credit. Yeah. So, moving on, Capa parachuted into Sicily with the second wave, only to discover that the US troops were welcomed as liberators rather than invaders, mainly owing to an effective radio propaganda campaign by the BBC's European service. And in Sicily, he didn't have to search too far to find the real casualties of war to photograph. Following the Sicily landing, Capa headed on to Naples. Naples had become the first major city to be liberated in Italy in 4 days of intense fighting. Residents had fought the German army. And I'll just find the little reading I've got here to introduce this next image. On the 2nd of October 1943, Capa entered a school to be greeted by what he later described as the sweet, sickly smell of flowers and the dead. Before him lay 20 coffins, not well enough covered with flowers or too small to hide the dirty little feet of children. Children old enough to fight the Germans and be killed, but just too old to fit into children's coffins. And if we move up, their black-clad mothers screamed in mourning, a few feet from the lens. These were my truest pictures of victory, he wrote, the ones I took at that simple schoolhouse funeral. And I think you will agree, very powerful images of these mothers mourning for their dead sons. So we come to D-Day. How would he play it? Well, the answer is let's just read you what he wrote in his book, Images of War. I would say that the war correspondent gets more drinks, more girls, better pay, and greater freedom than the soldier. But at this stage of the game, having the freedom to choose his spot and being allowed to be a coward and not to be executed for it is his torture. The war correspondent has his stake, his life in his own hands. He can put it on this horse or that horse, or he can put it back in his pocket at the last minute. I'm a gambler. I decided to go in with Company E in the first wave, and that meant Omaha Beach. Now, Capa, before I show you the images, I'll just tell you a little bit about what happened. Capa was dropped 100 yards from the beach and managed to shelter behind abandoned vehicles at the water's edge and began taking pictures. He fired off 4 rolls of film before jumping into another landing craft that took him to a ship heading back to Portsmouth. You might wonder why Capa looks so relaxed in this image. Well, it shows him at Portsmouth on the evening of the 6th of June. Job done. He'd deposited his films at the darkroom, and he was now heading back to the beachhead to join up with General Patton's fast-moving 4th Armoured Division to record their progress. Now, Capa was blissfully unaware that darkroom technicians had put the negatives into a drying cabinet with the heat set on too high and closed the door. And with no air circulating, the emulsion had melted. The lead technician studied the first 3 rolls of film and saw immediately that they were ruined. When he studied the 4th roll of film, his eyes lit up. Out of 72 images, 11 were printable, and these would forever be referred to as the Magnificent 11. And here we see there the first of his images. Capa had hung back in the launch craft to photograph the men. Of course, the launch craft man was desperate to get the hell out of there as quick as he could, and he gave Capa a swift kick up the backside and told him to go. Now, the second of these images, and I think it's my favorite, the fact that it's slightly out of focus works to great effect with this image. He captures the desperate plight of the men going ashore, the perilous situation they were in. These men, with the bullets pinging all around them, were basically running for their lives. It's an amazing photograph. And we see again, Capa was by this time crouched down behind an abandoned tank, and he just photographed what he could see around him. And we see one of the spreads, I think, from Life magazine, D-Day would forever be known by these pictures. And I think we realize that. We probably all would have seen the Spielberg epic, Saving Private Ryan. Well, there you go. You know, we can see how heavily he drew on Capa's images to get the film set just right. Now, for the record, Capa was initially told that the images he risked his life to take were ruined by seawater seeping into the camera, and not told the truth until a month later. What did he say? What could he say? He declared it was an honest mistake and insisted that the darkroom technician was not fired. He could have made the same mistake himself. Now, amongst those Magnificent 11 pictures was this one. You know, probably, again, one of the most famous images he ever took. Now, people were fascinated by this GI in the surf on Omaha Beach, and attempts were made to identify him. Was it Ed Regan? Regan claimed it was him, dined out on it for years. Why shouldn't he? He was on Omaha Beach. He was a hero. He had the picture. You can just see part of it framed on it behind his desk at the back. Or could it have been Houston Riley? Again, he claimed it was him, but it's very difficult to identify from those images. However, if you look at another picture of Houston Riley taken shortly after the war, I think we have our man. But whether it was Riley or not, the GI in the surf came to represent GI everyman. Around 50% of the invasion force were lost during the assault, adding up to between 2,000 and 2,500 casualties on Omaha Beach that day. Now, as I said, Capa joined the battle for Normandy with General Patton's 4th Armored Division and photographed their progress. This included photographing the faces of the defeated German soldiers as they were rounded up. Now, we also see a recently discovered image here. Well, it's a unique image, actually, of Capa photographing the surrendering German officers as the Patton made his advance towards Paris. Eventually, they came across the cathedral city of Chartres, where he took a very powerful collection of images. Now, the French forces of the interior were basically an unofficial force within France. They were ex-resistance activists who had basically become bandits, and they roamed the district, settling scores with collaborators. In this instance, women who had slept with Germans, in many cases, had children by German fathers. And Capa took a series of images of this woman and her mother. You can just see behind the man at the front. They both had their heads shaved and were paraded through the city while people poured scorn upon them. Over 20,000 women in France were punished in this way. And it seems grotesque today, but it must be viewed in the context of an age of bitter recrimination and retribution. Today, the humiliated women seems transformed into a dignified Madonna hounded by the mob. It emphasizes the point that Capa was forever moved by the suffering of individuals, regardless of politics or nationality. Now we come to my favorite of all Capa's France images, the liberation of Paris. Capa was the first American to enter Paris on Liberation Day, where he took this amazing image of the celebrations. I've got a huge blow up of this, which I used to have in my study many moons ago. Now, all was not completely safe as it might seem in this image. We see another image here he took more or less on the same day outside the Chamber of Deputies. Now, there were pockets of Germans and pockets of collaborators, people like that, hold up frustrated Germans, frustrated, defeated Germans, letting off rounds of ammunition here and there, frightening people half to death. And we see this incredible image here of hundreds of people cowering down, trying to dodge the bullets. And yet we see a woman and a man stood up, looking in the direction, trying to see where the bullets are coming from. Amazing. And also in Paris, he witnessed acts of revenge. We see here, these look like German soldiers who had been holed up, who had been sort of snuffed out, and we see a guy there. Another typical Capa image. You know, he just seemed to be on the spot when these kinds of things were happening. Before we wrap up, I want to show you a couple of images here that are often mistaken for Capa images. The Weeping Frenchman, very famous photograph. I've seen this included in collections of Capa's images many times. It wasn't taken by Capa. Nobody knows who the photographer was, and it wasn't even taken in Paris. It was actually taken in Marseille. Similarly, on the right, I've also seen this image attributed to Capa. It was taken by Joe Rosenthal, very famous image. It won him the Pulitzer Prize for photography of US Marines raising the flag on the island of Iwo Jima. Now, unfortunately, there's no happy ending to this story of Robert Capa's career in photojournalism. In 1954, he was in Indochina, covering the First Indochina War, where shortly after taking this image, he stepped on a landmine that exploded beneath him. He was immediately rendered unconscious and died before medics arrived at the scene. A sad note to finish on, and I want to finish off, if I may, just by reading a tribute to Capa from the great American author John Steinbeck. Now, the pair had traveled to Russia in 1947, where Capa photographed the images in Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kiev for a travelogue published by Steinbeck called A Russian Journal. Now, Steinbeck wrote of Capa, "I knew nothing about photography. What I have to say about Capa is strictly from the point of view of a layman, and the specialist must bear with me. It does seem to me that Capa has proved beyond all doubt that the camera need not be a cold mechanical device. Like the pen, it is as good as the man who uses it. It can be the extension of the mind and heart. Capa's pictures were made in his brain. The camera only completed them. You can no more mistake his work than you can the canvas of a fine painter. Capa knew what to look for and what to do with it when he found it. He knew, for example, that you cannot photograph war because it is largely an emotion, but he did photograph that emotion by shooting beside it. He could show the horror of a whole people in the face of a child. His camera caught and held emotion. Capa's work is itself the picture of a great heart and an overwhelming compassion. No one can take his place. No one can take the place of any fine artist, but we are fortunate to have his pictures, the quality of the man. I worked and traveled with Capa a great deal. He may have had closer friends, but he had none who loved him more. It was his pleasure to seem casual and careless about his work. He was not. His pictures are not accidents. The emotion in them did not come by chance. He could photograph motion and gaiety and heartbreak. He could photograph thought. He made a world, and it was Capa's world. The greatness of Capa is twofold. We have his pictures, a true and vital record of our time, ugly and beautiful, set down by the mind of an artist. But Capa had another work, which may be even more important. He gathered young men about him, encouraged, instructed, even fed and clothed them. But best, he taught them respect for their art and integrity in its performance. He proved to them that a man can live by this medium and still be true to himself. And never once did he get them to try to take his kind of picture. Thus, the effects of Capa will be found in the men who work with him. They will be found in the men who work with him. They will carry a little part of Capa all their lives and perhaps hand him on to their young men. It's very hard to think of being without Capa. I don't think I've accepted that fact yet, but I suppose we should be thankful that there is so much of him still with us. And that completes this talk, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll try and answer any questions, or I'd love to listen to any comments you might have.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. Please could you unmute, and we will say thank you in a normal way before we have the questions.